A goal kick for the Portland Timbers. The crowd at 31,000 on their feet now as Willie Anderson will kick it from this near corner. There's the shot. He's up in front. Jimmy Gabriel tries to get it out of there. He can't. Hank Leotard trying to get it out. Back to Jimmy Kelly. And Kelly controls for Portland. He goes to the corner to Anderson. Anderson has some space. Chips it across in front. There's the shot. Portland scores. Portland wins.
Absolute pandemonium. Somebody's going to get injured out there. That's going to be absolute pandemonium.
People all over the field as the Portland Timbers defeat the Seattle Sounders by a score of 2-1 with 1 minute and 29 seconds remaining in the first half of the sudden death.
We're going to have 4,000 people out there.
People running out of the stands, jumping up and down. You can see they're all over the field. What a finish for this game in Portland. There you see the stands. They're going wild. And we'll be back with a final wrap-up from Portland right after this commercial timeout.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Oh my God, it's bedlam, isn't it? Hi, Tim Hanlon here, and it's Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I thank you kindly for finding us in the wild and woolly set of choices that you have in podcast land. We appreciate it tremendously, and hope we entertained you this week as we try to do each and every week. And we veer back into professional soccer, as we certainly like to do on as many occasions as we can. And boy, oh boy, if that clip didn't sort of inspire some memories of the past and some of the glory days, if you will, the old North American Soccer League, geez, I don't know what will. We're going to kind of get into what I'm going to sort of make the argument about is perhaps the team that today probably has the best direct claim to being, I guess, the deepest and most legacy-rich of the, shall we say, current generation of professional soccer franchises here in the United States. And that's the Portland Timbers. Yes, Portland Timbers, of course, being a dynamic part of today's Major League Soccer, them obviously with the new renovation of today's Providence Park with that gorgeous top tier across the sort of the touch line and sort of now enveloping and keeping a whole lot of more of the noise of the fan base there within the boundaries of the stadium. That Providence Park, right, dates back to, you know, a time in 1975 or 74 or so when the Portland Timbers, the original Portland Timbers, 1975 that is, were an expansion franchise in the old NASL. That clip that you heard was one of their playoff games from their very first magical season, that being in what was then known as Civic Stadium, originally Multnomah Stadium. Yeah, you say that 3 times fast. It's hard. That was originally built in 1926. In other words, that game, by the way, from August 12th, 1975. We'll get into those specifics in a second. But that stadium, Civic Stadium, where that game was played against the Seattle Sounders, also now of Major League Soccer and an original member, not an original member, but a member of the old North American Soccer League. We'll get to that in a second. The lineage, right, of that Civic Stadium or Multnomah Stadium back in 26 traces all the way to Providence Park. And that's why I sort of claim, I think with legitimacy, why the Portland Timbers are probably the most legacy-filled team in today's MLS that can substantially date roots back to its previous incarnation and its arguably its direct lineage. The Portland Timbers, not the only franchise that has reignited itself in today's Major League Soccer. Of course, the San Jose Earthquakes, 2 versions of that in MLS. Obviously, the Seattle Sounders, which we just mentioned, and of course, the Vancouver Whitecaps. Those 4 franchises, which all came in the middle part of the 70s in the North American Soccer League. The only one of those franchises that still plays in its same original stadium, albeit updated and upgraded, are the Portland Timbers. We're going to get into some of the dynamics of the original Portland Timbers and why I think, frankly, it's important to kind of go back and kind of understand those first few years of the original Portland Timbers franchise and why it matters today. We get into all of that with our guest this week, Michael Orr, who fancies himself as a transplant to Portland, as well as a fan of the current generation team, and frankly was spurred by the arrival of the Portland Timbers in MLS and a desire to kind of go back in time and not, frankly, having any stake in the matter, having not grown up or lived in Portland prior, really, to kind of see what was this Timbers thing before this MLS version franchise, right? There are rumblings you'll hear in our conversation with Michael in a few seconds of like there was this team and there's a logo and who's this Timber, gym guy and all this stuff, right? And as the new team got going and coming back to the same stadium, I mean, questions were asked, and he made it a priority to dig with sort of open eyes and open mind as to maybe a little bit of an investigation as to what this team circa 1975 and beyond in the North American Soccer League was, the Portland Timbers. That's this topic of our conversation again this week with Michael Orr, the author of the book, The 1975 Portland Timbers, The Birth of Soccer City. And yeah, we're going to get into that too, the label Soccer City. Some other cities have sort of claimed that title over the years. But again, I think Portland has its rightly choice or opportunity to lay claim to that moniker. And again, for you historians, that game that we had the clip from comes from Como TV in Seattle. That was Bruce King, a longtime voice on Como TV Sports, along with Cliff McGrath. And that siren in the background as the Portland Timbers win that playoff game and then go on, obviously, to the 1975 Soccer Bowl, which was in San Jose against the Tampa Bay Rowdies, which they lost ultimately 2-0, I think it was. The siren apparently was being played by I think she was a actual government official in the city of Portland. I think, I'm not sure if I get her name right, but she was sort of a big fan of the team, and she was the one manning that siren in the background. And arguably, what you heard there was an out pitch invasion. And if you look at on YouTube and see these clips of this game back again from August 12th, 1975. When the Portland Timbers defeated the Seattle Sounders in sudden death overtime 2-1 to go on to Soccer Bowl 75. City Commissioner Mildred Schwab. Here's a trivia question for you. She was on that ambulance siren in the background going nuts. And yes, more than a few thousand people were stomping onto that pitch after that game. And boy, what a climax. That was the last home game of the season for the Portland Timbers in 1975, their inaugural one in the NASL. Seeds of Soccer City, USA, for sure, and all part of the legacy of today's Portland Timbers, and that's our conversation coming up in just a couple of moments. Before we get there, I want to say hello and again, welcome to one of our newer and great sponsors, and of course, that's the Great Courses Plus. And you will find them and more about them at thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. And again, what is the Great Courses? Well, it's unlimited video learning with the world's greatest professors. At least that's what we sort of call it. And it's by all means exactly that and more. PC Magazine says it's all you can eat. All you can eat. You can imagine all you can stream access to an excellent library of college level lectures. And USA Today says, tired of binge watching? Well, sure, try some binge learning. And that's what you're going to get to do at thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats, where you will get, for a limited time, a free month of the Great Courses Plus service. You can access all of these lectures and these courses online or via their app. You can stream using that app to any device. And that app is also cool because you can download in advance all of the episodes and the lectures in case you're not near a broadband connection or a mobile tower to get your streaming internet. Or you can also listen to these in audio only format should you not have the availability to be looking at a screen. Perhaps you're driving, let's say. But these are great courses, literally and figuratively, and a lot of great topics such as history and science and hobbies and health and fitness, and with some great experts, not only in terms of the teachers, but the organizations that are part of this coursework. Folks like the Smithsonian and National Geographic, the Culinary Institute of America. And of course, we also want to encourage you to try the Great Courses Plus at thegreatcoursesplus.com/goodseats for their current offering from the done in conjunction actually with the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and that's called Play Ball, and it's basically all kinds of coursework around the early history of professional baseball in the United States, and it's an amazing array of topics and courses, and it's fascinating. I'm about 15 or 16 lectures into it, and I still got plenty more to go, and I've learned something in each and every one of them, and you will too. When you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/goodseats, get your free month of the Great Courses Plus service and enjoy, perhaps to start, Play Ball, the series produced in conjunction with the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. I am certain that you will enjoy not only that series, but also the other array of offerings, again, from our friends at the Great Courses Plus. Again, one last time, thegreatcoursesplus.com/goodseats. Please get your free month and enjoy on us the Great Courses Plus service. We thank them for their sponsorship. And of course, we thank you for listening continuously to the rest of this episode with our pal, Michael Orr, as we get into the old North American Soccer League version of the Portland Timbers. Yes, they existed before you MLS fans of the Timbers. And here's our conversation coming right up. I'm assuming you're a Portland guy. How did you get involved or interested in going into the WABAC Machine to the earliest year or years of the Portland Timbers?
Yeah, I'm actually not a Portland guy, or not by birth. I've lived here for 10 years, but I grew up in Virginia and North Carolina. So I moved here in 2009, right almost exactly at the time that they made the MLS announcement, or the announcement that the Timbers of the A-League, USL, what all the various combinations of second division that they played in would be moving up to MLS. So I lived within a few blocks of the stadium and started walking over to games. And what mostly happened was I had a bunch of questions about who's the team's all-time leading scorer, or, if any numbers deserve to be retired beyond the ones that are, whose are they and why? And they're, other than sort of anecdotes or word of mouth, there weren't really a lot of answers. So I started looking for them.
Well, so that sounds like you're at least aware, or were aware, right, that this wasn't sort of just a brand new team with no heritage whatsoever. It did have a name, and that name evoked some kind of history that arguably was not well known, at least by you. Or maybe what about other fans too, right? How naive and or lacking of understanding of the original name and team of this. I mean, you're mentioning the USL and you're mentioning the A-League and that kind of stuff. But how much were you aware that there was a history even beyond that?
So when I moved to Portland, I was unaware of anything. I mean, I'd never heard of the Portland Timbers before. But people in Portland, I mean, I moved here in 2009. The second division reincarnation of the Timbers had been playing since 2001. So it wasn't, it wasn't like no one knew what this was, or that this announcement about MLS was somehow out of the blue. I mean, it was a very long and concerted effort on the part of the fans to convince city council to go along with Merritt Paulson to get an expansion franchise. So just because I was unaware of much when I got here doesn't mean other people were unaware. And as I started digging in and, meeting people and eventually formulating an idea for this book, and then started talking to people for that, there were people who, but by the time I was writing it in 2010 and 11, they had been season ticket holders every year that there was a team called the Timbers. So 75 to 82, 89 and 90, and 01 to present. So there's a lot of people who know what's going on. But that didn't mean they knew some of the answers that I was looking for, or what they knew was what they remembered from when they went to games when they were in high school, or, just there were pieces missing from sort of what I was looking for was, where's the book? Where's the place where I go? It doesn't matter what I know. If I want to get all the information about the starting points, where do I get that? And it didn't exist.
There's a loose awareness, I guess, that there is something before even this minor league Portland Timbers thing, but not a whole lot in terms of either written form or credibly factual. It almost feels to me like it's oral history or anecdotal more than anything else.
More than anything else, anecdotal. And I'll give you a good example. And I won't name names on this, but there was a person when I was sort of asking around just to kind of get my bearings on the longer term history stuff and trying to figure out where the team came from originally and how it got started and that kind of stuff. And I hadn't yet done any newspaper research, interviews, anything like that. I was just kind of asking around. And this guy told me, oh, yeah, well, I think it was sort of an offshoot of West Ham. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah. Well, the first Timbers USL coach had been at West Ham, and Clive Charles and Clyde Best, they'd played at West Ham. And I'm pretty sure it was like an offshoot of West Ham. And this guy was like a, pretty well-regarded person within the Timbers Army. And so I kind of took that at face value. And I assumed that if anyone else had asked a similar question of this person or others, they might have heard the same story. And that story is completely wrong. It's just completely incorrect. And the reasons that the guy gave were all true. Those people all had been affiliated with West Ham or had played there prior to coming to Portland for whatever reason. And that was all true. But what that person did was take what they knew and say, I know these things to be true, and so I'm going to conclude that the entire organization is therefore associated with West Ham, instead of doing, one bit of research about what the answer might be, or if there was some reason to doubt the veracity of that statement. So once I started asking those kinds of questions and getting some anecdotal answers, anecdotal answers are not necessarily wrong, but they're also not necessarily totally right or wholly right. And there's sometimes a lot more out there. And in the absence of someone having previously done that, there wasn't anything to refute what this guy said, because all of the baseline points were true.
Yeah, there's also no linchpin, right? So I maybe this is an interesting question to ask you. You're not only are you a new fan of the, shall we say, recently upgraded to Major League Soccer Portland Timbers, for all intents and purposes, an expansion franchise, but a continuation of this name in minor league form that obviously had some known roots elsewhere prior. But you're also new to the city, right? So you truly have a clean slate. What's your impression going in? I mean, you're hearing some of the rattlings of, hey, this name didn't come out of thin air. What's rolling around your mind about like, okay, well, how do I learn more about this by just asking people who are similar new fans of this team?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that without knowing anything about the team or, my knowledge, I'm 36. So, I was born the year after the Timbers disbanded, and sort of during the dying days of the NASL. So, I'm as a sports fan, and I was a history major in college. I mean, I was familiar with the NASL mostly through the Cosmos, and as I learned more about English soccer, George Best, and all this kind of stuff. And so I knew about the NASL, and I didn't, I knew there were a million teams, and I could never possibly know all of them. And so once I moved here, I knew that kind of stuff, and when I looked at the very bare minimum of a starting point, here's the Wikipedia page on the Portland Timbers. I'm going to go to the game for the first time. What's the story? Oh yeah, founded in 1975. Okay. And, everybody in Portland, even then and before that, everybody knew that. It wasn't like people weren't really sure, where it came from. Before the team moved to MLS, that was the main connection to first division soccer, was knowing that the team had previously been in the first division as it existed, 25 years prior or whatever the time frame was. So, it isn't like nobody knew who the Timbers were, and everyone had a connection. The team had the same logo. They played in the same stadium. A lot of the people who were fans, their parents had gone, when they were younger in the 70s, or they themselves had gone as children in the 70s. And so, there's definitely a strong connection there that people knew, but playing in the second division and knowing that there was a higher division that you can't access without expansion, sort of left a little bit of a disconnect. And so I think that it actually strengthened people's feelings about the original NASL team and hanging on to that and knowing that there was only one team in MLS in 2009, or I guess in 2009 there were then two that had names from the MLS, from the NASL era. The Earthquakes and the Sounders were, an expansion team to MLS in 2009. And so I think that in Portland, the connection to the old days is really strong, but there wasn't a centralized place to go to get information about it. So as time passed, people knew that this is what it was, but then the team didn't exist from 1982 to 89, and it didn't exist from 1991 to 2000. And so those are pretty significant gaps to, try and keep a fan base or a living memory, or, I like to use the term institutional knowledge, generational fandom or intergenerational fandom. Those are harder to maintain in those gaps. And so there might be a Timbers reunion game or something. And, fewer and fewer people as time goes on remember who the specific players were. They're just, those are the guys who used to, play here in the 70s, I guess. And so those were the gaps that I was looking for, or those are the gaps when I was looking for stuff that I found that I wanted to fill in, because even when I asked people or fans who'd been there forever, they didn't remember everybody's name, or they, when I go back and check later, they got the stuff they said was wrong. And not on purpose, not out of malice or negativity. It's just, if it's only in memory and there's nothing to really anchor any of that stuff, memories are hard to maintain accurately. Things change. People's perceptions of stuff differ over time. It's just hard to keep track of all that. And so, you said oral history. I think saying that the Timbers fandom, it's basically, it was a large oral tradition of certain things that were remembered and certain things that were forgotten, some of it selectively and some of it just because of time. And anyway, that's kind of what I found when I moved here. It turns out it wasn't that hard to find a lot of the information. You just had to kind of look for it and then put it all in one place.
Yeah, I think some of it's a little bit, probably benign neglect, right? Because you're mentioning gaps and minor league and people move on with their lives because it was a time and place. But frankly, we've sort of scratched a little bit of this as we've talked about certain NASL teams of the past, and they're, depending on where and what time you're asking, the often tenuous relationship between their former existences and their current iterations, brand name and all, in Major League Soccer. So I guess this is sort of a wind up to a question as we get into maybe sort of, some of the specifics of how you started to find information and what you did with it. When, if at all, did you start to sense, I wouldn't call it pushback, but not sort of a gigantically warm embrace by folks related to either the new franchise and or Major League Soccer to go back and remember this team from the supposedly failed North American Soccer League?
That's a really great question. And part of it is, there's kind of two sides to it. And the one is, and you kind of mentioned it, a lot of cities that had NASL clubs that currently have MLS clubs do not share names with those NASL clubs. And part of it, as my understanding is that when MLS was getting founded and they're creating the brands and names and color schemes, that they didn't want to be associated with something that fewer than 15 years earlier had completely collapsed, and the financial issues and troubles were, very well documented and pretty well known across sort of sports fandom in the country. And so I definitely can understand why clubs in the mid 90s did not necessarily want to be associated with those things. I know that the New York issue with the Cosmos was partly that and partly trademark related. But, I think with Portland and Seattle and San Jose and Vancouver, I mean, those teams all were sort of in the sort of middle wave of the NASL expansion, right? I mean, they're all 74 and 75 expansion teams. And I think that because I don't know, I don't know why those clubs, I mean, definitely Seattle and Portland and Vancouver had second division teams of the same name. And so it was a little bit easier to make that connection because they'd already done it. Someone else, previous owners, different iteration of the team, but that had already been done. And so to change the name when you go to MLS would have been very strange, certainly for Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, because they've been playing for 10 plus years in a different division against each other with the same names. They would have been really weird to change. I know the Sounders had a fan vote, and they decided to keep Sounders, but in Portland, there was never any question that they were going to keep the name because that's the connection that lends legitimacy when you're, an expansion team, 15 years after the founding of the league. You don't have to, you can say this is our MLS expansion, but we've been around since 1975. No outdoor professional soccer team in Portland has been called anything but the Timbers and has played in any stadium but where they play. Now that said, that doesn't mean that the ownership group or the people running the club wanted to be associated with the failure of the NASL. So I wouldn't say I got pushback necessarily when I started asking questions, but there was a definite sense of this is our version of the Timbers. And so the sort of the marketing decisions and the business decisions, which I think have been proven over time to have been very smart and really well pulled off, but they didn't necessarily focus on history apart from saying, hey, we've been around since 1975 and here's a couple of, old pictures sometimes. And, that for me personally was pretty frustrating, not because of any connection with research or work that I was doing, but just I thought they sort of owed it to the people who'd been around for, 35 years at that point, and just the soccer community in general that had wanted this team to come back and had wanted it to be named the same thing, to give it a little more credit and maybe highlight some of those players. Because one of the things that is true in Portland, and I know this is true in Seattle and San Jose as well, I assume in Vancouver too, that a lot of the guys who came over from England or other places in the 70s and early 80s, a lot of them stayed, or when their playing careers were over, they moved back. And so a lot of those guys are around. It wouldn't have been that hard. And the Timbers have since done a better job with that, sort of incorporating the former players, and particularly the former great players, into the team broadcasts and into the website and all kinds of things like that. But, so I think it's the way that those clubs in Portland in particular chose to do what they did. It made a lot of sense on a lot of levels, but I mean, yeah, personally, I thought the Timbers should have a Hall of Fame or have a place where they had all their trophies from different, times in the past, as something which they do now. But in 2011, they didn't have that. And I thought that would be just a super easy way. You're doing a big renovation of the stadium. Hey, here's all the trophies we've won in the past. Oh, you didn't know we had a past? Well, here's a little bit of, a couple of text panels or something to read up on just as a starter, in case you don't know the history. And if you do, here's a place to come celebrate it on the way to watch the new version.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, because I think you could make the argument that the rebirth of the San Jose Earthquakes, right, from the devilishly named San Jose Clash, in 99, 2000 or so, and then the Sounders, I think, as a name, if I'm not mistaken, I think was either either at the very bottom of the wish list or maybe even a write-in vote of the other names that were, kind of bandied about there when they were sort of formulating with Drew Carey and friends their entry into MLS as well. I mean, you have to look at maybe both of those sort of movements as maybe, I guess, a signal towards the inevitability of why not, right, look back, right? I mean, and I think, like Major League Soccer, as the story of its history gets written in its first 25 years or so, and Lord knows there's a lot more yet to come and some very, some major issues that still have to be solved, I think, going forward. And, success, yes, but, clearly some other things that have yet to be fulfilled. I do think that it actually, I think from a timing perspective, right, as the aughts sort of went on and into this decade, it almost became a backhanded sort of, I would say compliment, but almost convenience in that there was this history that, made Major League Soccer have something a little bit more, I don't know, some more greater staying power versus, say, how it first burst onto the scene with all these crazy cockamamie singular names in its attempt to be cool and hip and, completely radical, I guess, in terms of its vision for the future. And ironically, its future very much has a lot of, frankly, for a lot of a generation or two of fans, a surprisingly rich history and roots, right? And not just manufactured by calling a team FC this or something Real, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think, in Seattle, there was a team called the Storm, I think, and they're definitely in Vancouver was the 86ers, and they ultimately, after experimenting with those teams in lower levels, went back to the NASL names. Even before their moves to MLS. And I think sort of like you're saying, if you've got some history and you're in a sport where at the very least, the majority of sports fans in this country are unfamiliar with that history. I mean, people who love soccer know about the American Soccer League and Bethlehem Steel and all these kinds of things. But that's not by any stretch of the imagination a large percentage of overall fans. And if you're MLS and you're trying to capture new fans, you can't rely on people knowing all those things. But if you do have a few names that have a connection to decades past, yeah, it lends some legitimacy to the idea that you're not just a brand new thing, that this has been going on longer. And what you're doing now is just a more stable business version of what's been going on forever. And there are lots of things to quibble about with MLS and the way the business works and all that stuff. But I think from a naming perspective and a picking clubs to be expansion teams that were only expansion in like lowercase e expansion teams, right? Places that had existing second division teams, and that they've continued to do that, with places like, Orlando and Cincinnati and Nashville and stuff, whatever, that there's a greater chance of success. And also, there are people who have more invested in that sport in those locations over time that can only help the league. But I definitely Portland is one of the best examples of that with, I'm not here to criticize Seattle, as many Portland people do, but if you look at the Sounders USL attendance numbers, they're like 2,000, 3,000 people per game. Seattle from an expansion site makes a lot of sense based on the city and putting a team in the Northwest, but it wasn't like they had FC Cincinnati level, 20,000 people coming to Sounders games, but nowhere, nothing like that. So, Portland had a lot more than that. Vancouver had a lot more than that. So I think there's a lot of nice reasons to do that kind of stuff. And in Portland, when I got here, it was right at the beginning of that, not of the process to gain expansion, but then the process of going from a second tier team to a first tier team, and what kind of roster moves do you make, and stadium expansion, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, there's also one other sort of aspect, which I think is fundamentally, I think, unique relative to the today version of an MLS franchise and the previous version of the NASL, which is the stadium is exactly the same, not obviously in terms of amenities and all that stuff, but it is literally the same stadium, Civic Stadium, as it used to be known, right? Which is now today's Providence Park, which, continues to still feel very intimate. And now with the new gigantic sort of third tier, and, there's been a lot of loving recrafting, shall we say, of a gigantic part of what made the original Timbers, all that and then some back in 75.
Yeah. I mean, it's downtown, and the stadium was built in 1926. So I mean, it's been there for a long time, and there's been a lot of different things that have been in that stadium, from dog racing to baseball to all kinds of stuff. And when the Timbers started in 1975, there was I forget now, was it the World Football League? There was a Portland franchise in the World Football League.
Yes, the Portland Storm or the Portland
Storm. Yeah, I think they changed. Well, no, maybe there was.
You've not been listening, young man, to our episodes. Yeah, the WFL for its year and a half existence actually was two, if you will, separate leagues. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Storm was one name. Thunder was a second year.
Yeah, that's right. And so one of those years was 1975, and so the Timbers were sharing the stadium with them and the Portland Mavericks of Kurt Russell and Netflix documentary fame. And, so there was a lot going on, and, they had, AstroTurf field and, dirt on the first, second, and third base spots. And it was kind of an interesting place at the time because there was so much going on that field. But like I said before, no version of the Timbers, no professional outdoor team in Portland has ever played in a stadium except that stadium. It's harder when you're in a place where there have been teams in different previous leagues under different names, maybe with different colors, and you played in a different stadium from where you're playing now. The connections to make between those things are so much harder because you have to stretch so much further to make those connections. With the Timbers, the colors are the same, the name is the same, the stadium's the same. It's much, much easier to, some of these guys who I've talked to who were, bought season tickets when they were in high school or early college or whatever, and back in 75, they bring their kids and their grandkids, and they're like, well, that's where I sat with your mother, or that's where we, we sat over there. There's so much more connectivity with that. And, the stadium still existing in its location and all the reasons why other things didn't happen with that location could fill hours and hours of podcasts. But for all the random different reasons having nothing to do with professional soccer over the years, that stadium has not been bulldozed and sits very close in and on all the transportation lines, and has basically no parking. And so it has this real in the middle of town sense that is pretty hard to find with, most outside of the sort of Wrigley Field, Fenway Park. And, I'm not trying to equate those with, Providence Park, but they have that same, like, it's just in the neighborhood and there are apartments and houses and stuff right next to it that modern sports stadiums don't have. And so it really does just feel like part of Portland, instead of saying, oh, well, I'm going to go to this enormous arena with rings of parking around it. Or, if it's Philadelphia, I'm going to go to that place where all of the stadiums are located with all of the parking around it. I mean, those are great, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there is a difference in the feeling of just going to a stadium in the neighborhood and it being the same place that everyone's always gone to see professional soccer.
Well, and again, I think MLS came to that realization later in its tenure as well, right? In many respects, I would argue that the Timbers probably have been the best example of, hey, maybe building a brand new stadium in the suburbs, and as a long-suffering Chicago Fire fan, and the whole sort of escapade of Bridgeview, which is
the worst version of.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of other sort of reasons and all that stuff. But yours is the quintessential, the young adults, urban, centered environment, march to the park, all that kind of stuff is, and even better, the original stadium that the original Portland Timbers played in, with all the history extant.
Yeah, absolutely.
How much did Merritt Paulson bring to the table on this? Because, obviously the minor league baseball franchise was utilizing what was, still then known as Civic Stadium. But, my guess is that it was a relatively, well, I don't know. Was it controversial when not only he, bought the rights of the franchise, but then decided that the Timbers were going to be the sole participant or playing entity in that stadium versus, say, minor league baseball? Why did minor league baseball lose out per se? I mean, I think it's a pretty bold statement on his part. How much do you think he sort of saw history and that structure as part of that mix, or was it just a steel-eyed business decision?
It's a multi-layered answer to that question, but I think that the safest way to say it is, he bought both. So the Beavers was the baseball team, and that was a name that, while there had been some other times where there were minor league teams under other names, like the Mavericks, and there was a Rockies affiliate called the Rockies, but the Beavers had existed as a name since 1901. So it was a big deal for baseball to lose out in the way that it did in that stadium. But Merritt Paulson was the owner of both of those franchises. So, he to say he was only looking out, like to say he was looking for a way to get rid of baseball is definitely wrong. But in baseball in Portland, I should say. But I think what he did was, when he'd been the owner of the Timbers and the Beavers for a few years, when they started making the push for, MLS expansion, and, the Beavers, for all the history, they were drawing pathetic crowds. 5,000 people, and in a 25,000 seat stadium, and they had
not extremely well maintained either, right?
No. There were definitely different renovations over the years, and there had been a big one in 2001, but they had 300 season ticket holders, and it's not that people didn't like the Beavers and didn't like to have baseball in town, and there had been baseball in town for basically 100 years. But from a sports team ownership perspective, the number of season ticket holders for the Timbers was growing every year. And I think that he deserves some credit, because it wasn't a popular decision to get rid of the baseball team. That he definitely had some ideas of building a separate baseball stadium, a much smaller facility, in a couple of places in town. And when those ultimately turned out to be fruitless, that's when he ended up deciding to sell, and then the team relocated. So I don't know that he had a crystal ball, and I definitely don't think he was super pro soccer and super anti-baseball. But I think from a numbers perspective, it was becoming clearer and clearer that the city had a soccer history, and that if you actually invested resources in the team and in their marketing, that you could tap into that history. And, I think a lot of people, this is mid aughts is when he bought the Timbers, could see that soccer is growing. Maybe, soccer's always the next sport. I know that and everything, but it's, the numbers relative to minor league baseball made a lot more sense to invest his money on that side. So, and he wanted to be in MLS. He had tried to buy the Earthquakes before they moved to Houston, and that fell through for whatever reason. And so that, Major League Soccer was definitely a goal of his when he came to Portland. I don't think that meant that it would have to happen without baseball, but it became only possible to do one. MLS said you got to have a soccer specific stadium. You got to have a rectangular place, and that is not going to work for baseball. So once that all became clear and no stadium was able to be built, a smaller facility for them, then it was the obvious move. And so, he gets a lot of credit for sticking with it and investing the money. And, there are lots of things to say about Merritt Paulson, or, where his money comes from or how he uses it or whatever. And I'm not here to get into any of that because I think it's his own choice to do what he wants. But the fact is he's dumped a ton of money into the Timbers, and, from every, academies and artificial, really great artificial turf and renovations to the stadium multiple times. And, it just that's turned into having a 15,000 person waiting list for season tickets. It's pretty amazing. In a little more than 10 years, what his initial investment in the team has turned into.
All right, let's take a quick pause. We've got to pay some bills around here. It's not a charity, We want to say hello and welcome again to our friends at the Great Courses Plus. We love the Great Courses Plus. I am certain that you will too. What is the Great Courses Plus, you may ask? Well, I think the best way to describe them is unlimited video learning with the world's greatest professors. Like that tagline implies. If there's any topic under the sun, perhaps you want to harken back to your days at college, maybe you haven't yet gotten to college, or maybe you just didn't have the opportunity to go to college, here's an opportunity to kind of delve into a wide array of topics and categories and subjects that, without any exams or, any stress of studying in the realms of things like history or science, things like food and wine, maybe health and fitness, economics and law and religion, and in concert with folks like the Smithsonian or National Geographic, the Culinary Institute of America, and yes, even the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum for the current course that we love, and we're maybe about 7 or 8 lectures into right now. It is fascinating. Again, it's called Play Ball, The Rise of Baseball as America's Pastime. It is narrated and presented and taught by Bruce Markison of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. And again, a lot of different interesting discussional topics, some of which we've scratched the surface on in our various episodes. There's a lecture devoted to baseball's relationship with the press. Very interesting stuff. The statistical history and beginnings of baseball and why it's become arguably the most statistically detailed sport of all the sports in the United States. How the players and owners and this thing called the reserve clause. We've had a number of episodes devoted to that. The economics of baseball. Scandals and deception on the diamond. There's a whole lecture devoted to that. And many, many more. Up to, 24 lectures in video form. And it's, by the way, available online. You can download the app. It streams to any device. And that app, like I said, which streams to any device, you can also download all of the coursework onto your device. Let's say you're not going to be near an internet connection, or you can also listen to it in audio-only fashion. So let's say you're driving or doing something else that requires your eyesight but allows you to listen. That is how cool all of this stuff is. Again, it's the Great Courses Plus, and we have a special offer for our listeners to not only enjoy the entire series of Play Ball, but also all of the courses available to you at the Great Courses Plus. And that website is thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. Again, thegreatcoursesplus, all one word, .com/good seats. And you're going to get 1 free month, no strings attached, yours for a limited time for all of the courses, not just the baseball coursework, but all of the courses at The Great Courses Plus. Again, thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. You're going to get a free month of unlimited use to stream any of the courses at not only baseball, but any of the topics and the hundreds of other lectures and series available to you. And we thank our friends at The Great Courses Plus. Again, one more time, thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. Hope you enjoyed as much as I have been so far. And we also hope you enjoy the rest of our conversation coming up right now. So in your pursuit of going back into the history sort of roots of the original team that sort of begot all of this stuff, what's your strategy? Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to talk to a bunch of people? Do you interview them? Do you think it's going to be definitely a book? Do you think it's a documentary? Do you think it's a website? I mean, what do you think you're going to do with the knowledge that there is this team and there's information out there that is not well documented? What's your process in all of this? And how do you kind of circle around, say, a book of 1975, which is the first year of the franchise, as kind of one of your outputs?
Yeah, I mean, I think my first idea was of what it would turn into was I wanted to write a book about the NASL era in Portland. And it took about 15 seconds to realize that would be biting off way more than I could chew, because I wanted to do what I really wanted was to get the information out there. I mean, it's definitely not, the best narrative book that's ever been written. I mean, it is an information dump. And part of the reason for that is that information wasn't, it's not that it wasn't available, but it wasn't available in one place. So once I sort of understood the level to which I wanted to, or the sort of the granular detail I wanted to get into, I realized that doing a book about, 8 years was way too much. Too many people I would have to interview, too many, box scores and match reports to go through, from newspapers and all that kind of stuff. It seemed too overwhelming. And so I thought that if I was going to do less than that the only thing that made sense was to do the very first season. And actually, I did briefly consider doing the last season of 1982, but that seemed like it'd be kind of a downer. And I was starting to do this in the build up towards MLS. So I was hoping I missed by a year, but I was hoping to do something around the same time that the MLS team launched, and sort of here's the first team and here's the new team, same time kind of thing. But so then, I mean, like I said, there's a lot of guys who had played in the 70s who either never left or moved back. And a lot of those guys are, or at that time were, still very involved in either youth or collegiate soccer in the Portland area. So a lot of people knew how to get in touch with, I looked at one newspaper report and well, here's all the names of the guys who played in the game. Well, since I didn't grow up here, I wasn't familiar with very many of them. And as I started to talk to other people who I, met at Timbers games and stuff, they'd say, oh yeah, well that guy's he's the coach over at such and such high school, or, oh yeah, he's the women's coach at the University of Portland, or, whatever. And so then I realized, wait, there's all these guys. They're actually here. I don't have to even do something like what we're doing right now. I can hopefully talk to them in person. I can maybe go to their house or meet them at a bar and get an actual interview, and get to know these people who are going to be the people who are in the book. And then I can compare what they have to say about their experiences from 35 years prior with what the newspapers say happened in those games and in those practices and on the travels and trips that they took and whatever. So, I mean, started with one, and that helped lead to, with the players, helped lead to others. A lot of these guys didn't want to just tell their story to anybody, or didn't want to sort of invest in the possibility of going deep into their experiences and their memories until they knew, if it was going to be legit or if there was going to be actually an end product or what. And once that ball started rolling, each guy helped kind of reel in the next, until I talked to most of the living members of the team.
Yeah, it's almost like you become a firekeeper in some respects, and maybe almost an unwitting Timbers historian, if there is such an official title for that.
It was what it was witting. I mean, it's what I wanted to have happen. I mean, I wanted it to be more official than it was, but that's what I wanted to do, was to get these guys to talk to each other. And you can always remember more things, even if they're anecdotes that end up being slightly off from the sort of printed record of whatever it is. Getting those guys to talk to each other not only got them excited and kind of got me in the door, but also oh yeah, don't you remember this? Oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Oh wait, wasn't this guy the other owner in the ownership group? Didn't he? They brought memories out that I could never have known the kinds of questions to ask to generate those answers. They did that amongst themselves, just by hanging out again, and talking to each other about it, and it gave more life to the project for me and to them. And once they were invested in that way, then it wasn't even about me. I was just the person writing down the things that they were saying, that either no one had asked them or no one had written down when they had something to say about it.
Well, as 1975 becomes the focus of your efforts, right? The first year in the NASL for the Portland Timbers, what started to emerge as elements of the story? Because by all accounts, it was a pretty rapid ascension, right? From the formation of the team to it getting on the field, and the love affair, I guess, of Portland, just falling for this professional soccer team that year.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of had the perfect timing in a certain way, in that while the Mavericks baseball team was sort of getting a lot of attention, they were an independent baseball team. They were not affiliated with any major league club, and they were getting a lot of pressure, and they ultimately went away. And there was this other football team, the Thunder in 75 that we talked about, and it was the off season for the Trailblazers, and they were still really bad. They hadn't yet won their NBA title. It was right after Bill Walton's rookie year. And so,
only by the way, the Trailblazers only 5 years old at that point, right? I think they started in 1970, if I'm not mistaken. So Portland, by the way, not the sports mecca, if you will, by any stretch.
No, and so there was room for, in a way that in other cities maybe there wasn't as much room for something else. And it was the summer, and Portland is a pretty wet and gloomy place. Except in the summer. In the summer, it's awesome. I actually like the clouds and the rain, but it never rains in the summer here at all. And so you can count on being able to go out to the ball game of whatever sport you like. And so the Timbers fit into this spot where there wasn't the highest level of other professional sports going on around them, and the Trailblazers were in the offseason. So they didn't really have a ton of competition in that regard. They, you're absolutely right about the rapid, or the rapidity of their ascension. They had so many problems raising the money to get their club off the ground that they missed the draft. So they basically had to pull the whole team together in about a month, from naming it to coming up with a schedule to actually getting players over from England, to having tryouts for the North American requirement for the rosters. I mean, they had to do everything kind of all at once. So it is a little amazing that they were good in one sense, because they didn't have any time to prepare. But what they ended up doing was they got a bunch of guys generally from the same part of England. I mean, their coach was Vic Crow, who had been the manager at Aston Villa. He had also previously been in Atlanta in NASL in the very early days. So he had a connection to dealing with stuff and the peculiarities of travel and of roster building in the U.S. But he had all these guys who he'd been their coach at Aston Villa, and he had pretty deep roots in that part of the country. So most of the Timbers players in 1975 had either previously played at Aston Villa, were currently at Aston Villa, they were at Wolves or Birmingham City. I mean, it's more than, I think about 2/3 of the roster comes from that same, Birmingham area in England. And so they had guys who were familiar with each other from having played together and guys who were familiar with each other from having played against each other. And if you're going to put the team together at the last second, that's definitely the best way to do it, because then you at least have some working starting point, from which to launch this endeavor. And, it worked out awfully well. I mean, I think that the love affair aspect of it, I mean, the Timbers were for the era high scoring and exciting to watch. They played a really attacking, true 4-3-3 with these super fast, crafty wingers. And if you don't have a ton of experience watching soccer or soccer at a high level, if you're going to get guys who can send in a bunch of crosses and then you have a big towering forward up front who's going to head them in and score, you're going to score 3 goals, 4 goals often when you're playing at home. That's exciting. And they almost never lost at home, and that helped. And they just sort of caught fire at a time when, no one knew any better. No one knew any different. There wasn't a lot of competition, and they were good and exciting. It was just sort of a perfect little storm of generating a fan base from, next to nothing.
Well, they also wound up winning what de facto now is known as the Supporter Shield. They were the best regular season record, and obviously in the old NASL points aggregation in the league in the regular season, and went all the way to the final game against the second best team, I think by 3 points off. They were the Tampa Bay Rowdies that year in 75. So, I mean, you could not have scripted an on-field performance probably much better than the Timbers did, with the exception of not winning the full-on championship. But how about the city itself? The fans, in your investigation and the people that talked to you, was it because of the novelty, you think? Was it because of the summertime, gap filling? Or do you think that the soccer was something that itself was attractive and just gained fans because it was not only different, but, exciting and fun to watch?
I mean, I don't want to go with the easy route here and say all of the above, but it kind of is all of the above. I mean, I think if the very first game that the Timbers played, they played the Sounders in Portland. It was raining. There were 6,000 people there, and they lost. So it's not like the whole thing was some foregone conclusion because of circumstances. Those circumstances had to be realized. And if the Timbers had been bad, but the weather was nice and there wasn't a lot of competition, they probably still would have gotten some healthy crowds, just because there was some novelty to it and the weather was nice and it was something to do on the weekend. If they'd been really great, but they'd been overlapping, if they played in the winter, if, for example, the schedule had been such, I don't think they would have gotten the turnout, because the weather's terrible. People like basketball. Even the Blazers were bad. People still preferred that. They still do. So I think it is a combination of those things. But, for the relatively limited soccer knowledge that existed here, people can appreciate enthusiasm and athleticism and high scoring. And a lot of the guys, there were sort of two levels of players here for the most part. Guys who are sort of on the back end of their careers, who were sort of just doing a favor for their old coach, or a bunch of youth team guys who were 19, 20 years old, who were coming over to the U.S., like everywhere else in the NASL, to get some minutes, to get some time. They're just coming out on loan. Their clubs wanted them to get some experience playing against relatively high level competition and get some minutes and come back and try to contribute with the home club. So, those guys were super enthusiastic about scoring goals and practicing hard and giving everything they had because they were doing it. A lot of the guys, it was their first time ever leaving England, to say nothing of coming to the United States. For them, it was a big adventure that had a huge payoff on the back end if they succeeded and impressed their managers back home. So I think, I think fans of any sport can see and notice real enthusiasm and people who are investing their whole selves into what they're doing. And, for a lot of reasons, there were a lot of Timbers players doing that. And then when you do that and you succeed, that's just sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then crowds get bigger, you keep scoring goals, you feel better about yourself and everyone can tell. And, the Timbers were smart too. They in the way that they marketed the team right off the bat, they would have parties at this hotel downtown on Broadway, and it was open to the public. So the Timbers had a home game. Afterwards, they'd take a shower, do their interviews, whatever, and then they go to the hotel and they just have a big open ballroom and, open bar, and fans could come in and get pictures taken or shake hands or have a conversation with the guys who they just watched on the field. So they could have this very personal connection if they wanted. With these guys who normally you only see, athletes of that caliber from afar. And as time has gone on, from behind, basically behind glass, they're protected so much, and we understand why. But in those days, you could do that. So I think all of that sort of spilled directly into this what became an overflowing cup of enjoyment and entertainment and success, and then ultimately passion of fans for, a city that doesn't have a ton of professional sports options. It's not super hard to fall in love with a team that's really good when you don't have a lot of other options to choose from.
Did you get a sense of where the term Soccer City USA came from that year?
Yeah, it was as far as was known by any of the players, and it was reported in the papers at the time. The general manager of the team, Don Paul, who had actually played in the NFL with the Rams and the Browns, I think. Anyway, he was given an interview with the Oregonian newspaper, and Seattle was coming to town, and it was the first time Portland was selling out Civic Stadium. This interview was the day before the game or whatever. And so he said in this interview, we're going to show him who the real Soccer City USA is. And that's at the next game, the game against Seattle, someone I read it in the paper and made a giant banner and hung it on the outfield wall. It said Soccer City USA.
Yeah, it's iconic, actually, that picture. I remember vividly from lots of stuff. There's
two great versions of it. One is the one that most people know, where it's like some Boy Scouts hanging the sign up. It was on the cover of a Kick magazine, for example. But there's another version, which isn't really well known because you'd have to go through, I guess now it's online, but at the time it was a microfilm situation. There was a photo, I think it was in the Oregon Journal, which is a no longer existing newspaper, but was at the time a competitor of the Oregonian. And they've got a photo from the next day when the Thunder were playing an exhibition game. And over you could sort of see the linemen and the quarterbacks, under center. And in the background is this giant Soccer City USA sign right over, whoever took the photo for the paper framed it perfectly. And to me, that's an even more iconic photo, even though it's not really well known, because you're getting some additional context that there's another thing going on in the same stadium the next day. And yet there's nobody in the stands for that. And there were 27,000 people at a soccer game the night before, and the sign's still hanging there on the wall. Now, I don't know if that's a term that Don Paul had heard somewhere else and was repeating it to say, they may think they are, but we're really I don't know. It's the only printed, or it's the earliest printed version of that saying in Portland that I've ever found. And none of the players or any of the fans ever remembered anything other than seeing it on the wall before that game in July against Seattle. So I wish I had a very, very definite, specific answer to this question, because, or I wish that someone did, because it would end a lot of the conversation online about which, the provenance of that saying and about which city it refers. But definitely in Portland, it's a late July Seattle game, and a interview from the general manager with the newspaper.
That's very interesting. And one last question sort of on that 75 season then is, what of the rivalries at that point, right? Obviously in the Western Division, as it was newly set up in 75, the Timbers were categorized with the Sounders in Seattle, the Whitecaps in Vancouver, which today obviously is known as sort of the Cascadia Cup kind of series, but also the LA Aztecs and the San Jose Earthquakes, which, by the way, had become quite the thing in 74 themselves as a phenomenon, to kind of taking, frankly, I think the NASL, frankly, to another level at that point, maybe even giving them the grist to even double down on the West Coast, and more particular, the northern West Coast, with the advent of Portland and Seattle and continuing their investment in Vancouver. When did the rivalries, were they immediate and because of their geographic proximity, or did they take time to build and percolate, or in 75, this very first season?
Yeah, there's a couple ways around this, and I the thing that always surprises people when I either get this question or when I talk about it is that the Sounders during the season were not the Timbers' number one rival. Now, that's on field, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But I want to, Portland and Seattle, and to a lesser degree, Portland and Vancouver, they'd had teams, and not only were the Sonics and the Blazers playing in the NBA at the same time by then, but they'd had, minor league hockey and base, the Rainiers and the Beavers had played against each other in baseball for, 75 years. I mean, those were established rivalries just because of location between those cities in all sports. So there was a definite rivalry immediately, no matter what. If the teams had been both bad, this is in particular with Portland and Seattle, they're both bad, both good. They ended up being both good and playing in the playoffs, but that didn't have anything to do with whether or not Portland and Seattle were going to be rivals. They definitely were going to be rivals immediately and automatically. But in the actual season, I guess really up until the playoffs, because like I said, the Timbers did have that dramatic overtime win against the Sounders in the quarterfinals. But during the season, it was really San Jose, and they had some major problems, the Timbers did, with the way that the Earthquakes ran their organization, controlled their fans. They didn't like Crazy George at all. And so there was a lot of, there were a lot of fights, red cards, fans, throwing things on the field, hitting players, players trying to go into the stands and fight fans. I mean, it was definitely ugly scenes. And, in the very first game between the two teams. And so I think they had a really intense on-field rivalry. And then they also had some fun sort of off-field, like the Timbers made a really big deal and they complained to the league and they said they would never play in San Jose again. And, the league kind of talked them down. So when Portland came back to San Jose, the Earthquakes got one of the tigers from the zoo or somewhere and had it, someone had it on a leash or whatever, but sort of on the sideline, and the joke was sort of like, this is, the Timbers want to make sure there's adequate, security. Well, nobody's gonna rush the field or throw stuff when this tiger's, kind of roaming around here, and there, photos in the paper and stuff like that. And so, I mean, that's kind of like one of those fun, goofy, NASL kind of stories, but it came out of, or, sort of in response to the Timbers legitimately being upset and, really being worried about player safety, both on the field and then in interactions with the fans. And so I think a lot of people don't expect that to be, that San Jose is sort of the original rival. But with anything between Portland and Seattle, I mean, over time, that geographical rivalry is going to ultimately be the number one rivalry, no matter what's, the quality of the teams or the number of people in the seats.
That's really interesting. All right, so let me ask you one last question then, and this is great. I mean, we could go on for hours, I think.
Yes, definitely.
About sort of these connections, but I do think one of the grandest traditions is the continuation of Timber Jim and Timber Joey from, I guess, the earliest days. I'm guessing 75 as well. What did you learn sort of about sort of that, and maybe you tie it all together? How does that come back in modern form as perhaps maybe the ultimate expression of history runs deep and arguably maybe symbolically with rings of a very large tree going back in time? Yeah,
I mean, so Timber Jim did not do his act in the very first season, and the Timbers had a couple of other mascots. I forget now the name of the very first one, but it was, literally a guy with a tree costume, sort of a Douglas fir costume, playing a trumpet on the sideline. There's like a couple of photos, maybe one in a newspaper, a few that I've seen from fans who took it. But so Timber Jim, he came to some games, I think, in the first season, but he got involved with the Timbers, I think, in 1977. And I mean, a true lineman, and it's not his what we would say is his act is not, I mean, it is an act, but it's, he actually, that was his job, to use that kind of equipment, the chainsaws and the climbing gear and all the stuff that he's, most famous for. That was real. And, that timber was one of the major industries in this state for the majority of his existence. And so he basically just went and asked the team, like, hey, can I show up with the chainsaw? And they said, well, no.
Yeah. What could go wrong?
Yeah. Like, what are you, nuts? Like, of course not. And to be honest with you, I can no longer remember what it was that ultimately convinced the Timbers front office at that time in 1977 to let him start doing that. And the scale that he did it on at first was very small. It was not a log. It was not a tree. It was like a 2x4. And, it was he didn't walk around with the chainsaw in the stands. I mean, it was sort of behind the goal is kind of where he was limited to. But he became so popular, and obviously it's right in the window, not just with soccer, like we're talking about with Crazy George, but the Philly Fanatic and the San Diego Chicken and all these like iconic, goofy, mascot-y things. A lot of those are sort of right in the same time period as coming to prominence, and teams using those kinds of things as both entertainment and as a draw. Entertainment to those who are already there and as a draw to potential future people to come. And I think because it was pretty legit as far as it being his actual job, and in those days Portland was not this like left-leaning hipstery bubble at all. It was a pretty conservative place and pretty small town relative to cities, and like I said, timber was still the dominant industry in the state, and it seemed pretty authentic, and they ultimately gave him a lot of room to sort of do whatever he wanted. But the main reason that we still have it now in the MLS era is that when the Timbers came back in 2001, so did Timber Jim. And that didn't necessarily have to happen. He could have moved or, done something else with his life, or, not gotten into soccer again or whatever. But
was that of his own volition, or was there a reach out by anybody in the team at that point to say, come on back?
I don't think that the team actively sought him out in 2001. There was a lot of stuff going on in Portland and in Oregon around then, where the eco activist Trey Arrow was doing a lot of stuff here, and hunger strikes and all these kinds of things. The Timbers actually had a different logo for the first few years of their reincarnation in the aughts that didn't have an axe on it, because there was sort of a negative view of deforestation that this guy and the sort of environmental movement was sort of pushing at that time. So I don't think that they actively sought out a guy who would then be, need a already cut down tree and then, chopping or sawing additional pieces off with the chainsaw. But a lot of the people who went to those games in those early days in 01 and 02, they had been going to games in the 70s and early 80s. So they were familiar with him, and he was pretty well loved from, the old days. And he just kept doing his thing. And so anybody who went to see soccer for the first time after the NASL era, or most of the time in the NASL era too, you got Timber Jim. And, he'd stand on the dugout and lead the chants and cut down the logs and climb up the light poles. And he did all this stuff. And, that was sort of a central rallying point, because he's such a nice guy and he's such an enthusiastic fan, and he, just has this personality and aura about him that just draws people in. And, you want to fight alongside whatever Timber Jim's fighting for, independent of the fact that he's, wielding the only chainsaw around. So, when they went to MLS, he sort of right before that, he decided to retire from doing all the games, and and then doing, like, he started doing community appearances and that kind of stuff. So he stopped doing that, and Timber Joey took over, and they do stuff together sometimes still, and Jim still goes to all the games, and sometimes he'll still get down in the front and lead a chant or two, but Joey does all that stuff too. And then, but in much more so than Jim, Joey is actually an employee of the team. So, he'll go to the grocery with one or two players to sign autographs on a Wednesday afternoon, and, just do those kind of community appearances. I mean, it's much more of an organized, official mascot, than what Jim did. But, it's super weird and unique. Anytime anybody I know from growing up, or my parents or whatever, watch on TV, or people still can't believe that there's a guy with a chainsaw in a stadium. But here that's not a novelty anymore. It's just what it is, and people love it because it has that connection to the past. He's one of those guys. I mean, the Timbers, until before 2011. They had retired one number, which was Clive Charles, who passed away from cancer, and I think in 2003. And he'd been a player for the Timbers and also a coach of the University of Portland, and also involved with the Olympic teams for the U.S. And then the only other thing that was up in the rafters was Timber Jim's name with crossed chainsaws behind it. I mean, it's a really it's I guess what I'm trying to say is the connection with him is just in connecting the present with the NASL past is just as strong through Timber Jim as any of the players, or coaches or fans. Those were essentially equal leading up into in the MLS era. So I think, it's sort of weird and unique as it is, it really does fit in kind of with the rest of the story that, if you want to establish a connection or remind people of an already established connection between the past and with the NASL, you can do it with on-field stuff. You can do it with players and coaches, and you can do it through Timber Jim and having that extra layer, that people may not have known anything about soccer when they were going in the 70s, but they remember Timber Jim. That's really helpful when, moving up back into the first division and finding some way to bring it all together to say, hey, we're one of the few places that has all the history. Let's lay it all out for you. It covers every part of the spectrum.
Yeah, and there's a balance there, right? And you could you juxtapose that with the relatively new traditions that are at least being started, right? The Bell in Montreal, or the Wonder Wall in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and no disrespect to any of those things, right? But those are, I wouldn't call them artificial, but they're brand spanking new, right? And of course, if they continue to gain traction, they become tradition over time. But again, uniquely, you don't have to create something from anew. You can actually, you're burnishing something that started from the past that is all new again and has all that history attached to it. This is an amazing sort of journey, because I do think, if you really think about it, the team that probably has the most, I guess, depth in terms of roots and heritage and connection, I guess, to its current iteration. I mean, I would venture to say it is the Portland Timbers, right? In terms of history, I having grown up as a Cosmos fan and knowing that it exists as a minor league NPSL team right now, right? That brand still lives on, but albeit somewhat sort of on a much smaller basis. Arguably that could have had a chance should the rebirth of the NASL had taken root, and who knows, maybe it will again. But I think until and if that ever happens, right, which may not, I think you could safely say that the Timbers are probably the deepest rooted American soccer franchise, both of past and now. From start to current.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said it and not me, because I'm biased as a fan of the team. But it's true. I mean, like everything we've said, it's the same name for the team with basically the modernized version of the same logo in the same stadium. I mean, there on those levels, there isn't anyone else even remotely close that can match each of those things. No one plays in the same stadium at all. Very few of the logos resemble the ones from the 70s, other than sort of promotional, one-offs and stuff, which is fun and great, and I'm glad people do it. Only, like we said, only those four teams have the same names. So, I think you're definitely right. Even the Timbers don't have the most storied history of success, certainly of any team out there, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything relative to that sort of level of or that depth. I think that was a perfect word for it. It's just a depth of options for what attracts you to a sport or a team. And there's a lot of different things that can feel comfortable and feel normal because it's all the same.
All right, time to promote. How do we find out more about this book? And frankly, have you given it some further thought to maybe go deeper into the entire 8 years plus of the original Timbers, now that you've had the opportunity to get this first year out and some fandom under your belt as a fan of the current team?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to go back and do a bigger version. I hope that someone else does. And that's part of what I wanted to do in getting this book out there in the first place, was give other people a starting point to do some of this stuff on their own. And in no way am I suggesting that I'm the only person who's ever looked into the Timbers or ever written anything about it. But it's that's a project that's, I think, too big for me. That I don't know that I have the time or the ability to do anymore. But I really hope someone does it, because it's a worthwhile thing. And there's some great stories and weird stuff, in particular about the ownership of the Timbers from 1980 to 82 is some of the weirdest stuff. And the coaching changes and who the general manager was. This is a tease for anyone who wants to do a little bit of digging. There is some weird stuff that happened with the Timbers, and they almost went out of business a couple times. And before ultimately, there's some fun and interesting stuff out there, to find. But I'm not sure I've got it in me to do a whole other book. But as far as the one I did write, the official title is very boringly the 1975 Portland Timbers. The subtitle is The Birth of Soccer City, USA. And at this point, I think Amazon is probably the best place to find it. If you're in Portland, there are sometimes still copies of it at Powell's Books, which is the huge independent bookstore. And anyone who's been to Portland has been to Powell's. But otherwise, I think Amazon's probably the best option to find that. It's still, people still buy it around Christmas and stuff like that. It's definitely still, it's not out of print. It is still available. And it's, I don't know. It's, if you really like stuff about formations and stories about travel, going to different cities and guys who've never done it before, that's a lot of what it is. And it was a blast to do, and feel really lucky that those guys trusted me enough to tell me their stories and allow me to fact check it against newspaper reporting and sometimes tell them they were a little bit off and still work with me afterwards to give me more. So anyway, it was great. And thank you for giving me a chance to talk about it. I loved doing it, and I could talk about it all day and night.
The pleasure's been all mine, frankly, for having you. One last, I guess, very last question. Where will we find you when we watch national broadcasts of Timber games in the stadium? and what's your critique of the new renovation and that gigantic tier that they just recently installed on the far side?
Well, I'll start with the second part. I actually don't. I have no qualms with it at all. I think it's great. It really. Well, there's only been one game with it so far, but it keeps the sound in. One of the main features of the previous version of the east side of the seats was very important that it kept a view open to the street, which had always been the case in that stadium, always all the way since 1926. That is now gone, which is a little bit of a shame in some ways, but the way the sound stays in is really amazing. It's a beautiful thing. They did a lot more work in the stadium than just building that new stand. They repainted everything, redid all the concessions and team store and all that stuff. They really took advantage of the opportunity to do that. So it's a really nice experience in there. It's really it's a real legitimate upgrade. That's not just the word. It really feels different. As far as where I am, what I usually tell my parents is I'm the guy with the beard wearing green. Which is,
really narrows it down.
Yeah. No, but I have season tickets in the Timbers Army. I've had them since 2010. And so I'm just down there in the mass of people in the north end of the stadium behind the goal. I don't do as many of the chants and stuff and the intensity like I used to when I was younger, but that's where my tickets are. There's a 15,000 person waiting list, like I said. So something I will never be doing is giving up my tickets. When I can't go, I give them to a friend or whatever. But down there in the north end with all the loud and crazy people, it's really a really wonderful and fun experience and place to go. Even though I've been going for 11 years now, and it's no less fun than it was the first time I went.
Our thanks to the unofficial historian, maybe the official historian. I don't know. If there isn't a role, I think Michael Orr should be it. But we do thank you, Michael, for joining us and giving us some insight into the original Portland Timbers. And yes, again, I will make the case and I will stand by it. Sure, there are plenty of other legacy teams, some of which are in MLS, some of which are not, say like the Tampa Bay Rowdies or, of course, the New York Cosmos and some other diaspora of some of the original names from, say, the old North American Soccer League. But I think the cleanest and most direct heritage lineage of any of those teams that came in that heyday of the NASL and that lives on truly in purpose and in verve and uninterrupted, I think, frankly, from its original logo, its original stadium, and its original zeitgeist. And frankly, some of its even original traditions, with Timber Joey taking over for Timber Jim with the cutting of the log after every goal. It is the Portland Timbers. I'm not going to fight you on it, but I'm certainly going to defend it. And I thank Michael for bringing us some goodness from the old days of the NASL, and obviously lots more goodness ahead for the Portland Timbers in the years to follow. The book that Michael wrote that I highly encourage you to get and read and devour as I have. It's called The 1975 Portland Timbers, The Birth of Soccer City, USA. It is published by The History Press. And of course, you can find it and all of the other books and other forms of media that we talk about here on this show, of course, wherever good books are found. But if you'd like to do us a solid and give us a few shekels of love, why don't you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and just search up this episode with Michael Orr on the Portland Timbers and click on the link, why don't you? And you'll be whisked away to Amazon. You can buy the book through their website, and we'll get a couple of pennies or maybe a nickel or two, and that helps keep our lights on. We appreciate that. I'm sure Michael appreciates it as well. And if you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber with Amazon, actually, I think that the book will cost you nothing. It is part of the Kindle Unlimited service. So another great example of why Amazon is a good place to do that, and perhaps even a good incentive to maybe subscribe to Kindle Unlimited as well. But if you want a paperback copy of the book, you can do it that way. Whatever you want, we've got it all there for you. Just search up this episode with Michael Orr. Hopefully you'll be glad you did. And of course, that's the website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You want to find out what's going on in this show. All of our old episodes are there for you to stream or to download, do whatever you like. There's all kinds of cool images and photos and synopses of all the shows and all kinds of links to relevant items and or books and or other forms of media. It's all there. Of course, you'll find all our social links there too. On Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You will find the link to our Facebook page devoted to us. You will also find a link to sending us some email if you'd like, or you want to do that directly, do that too. Sure, why not? At hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And last but not least, you want to sign up for our weekly email newsletter when we kind of give you a tip sheet on what we're going to be talking about the next week. You can do that too. There's a convenient link on the site there as well. We're going to build out a lot more stuff, some more merch to come, and all kinds of good stuff. So visit there early and often, bookmark it, why don't you? And we thank you. Again, that's goodseatsstillavailable.com. And one last thing we want to say, of course, our continued thanks to our pals at Podfly Productions. You know Jerry Payne. You've never met him. He's never been on air before. Someday we'll drag him on the behind these microphones, but he's the guy responsible for helping us get our stuff together each every week. And we drive him nuts, but he still keeps coming back for more, and we appreciate it. And you can find out more about Podfly Productions at their website, and that's podfly.net. All right, we are done. I appreciate to no end you giving us a listen. And we're going to take you out with, believe it or not, 1975, Peter Yates and team had a song devoted to the Portland Timbers. It was called Green is the Color. And here's that theme song for all you Portland Timbers original fans out there. Enjoy that and enjoy your summer, everybody in Portland and elsewhere. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, our ticket window is now closed. Take care, everybody.
Well, the city's been so quiet since the boys in green went back, but it only took them 3 months to put Portland on the map. Yes, the stadium's never heard the sound of cheers in all its years. When the players come on the field, the thousands singing in their ears. Green is the colour, soccer is the game. We're the Portland Timbers, and winning is our aim. So let's give all of the boys a cheer, for the Portland Timbers will be here. Now the stadium's dead without him as the cobwebs start to form. Still the fans, they sit here waiting for their Timbers to return. In the taverns on a weekend, you can hear them from afar, singing praises to their Timbers as they're lifting up their jars. Green is the colour, soccer is the game. We're the Portland Timbers, and winning is our aim. So let's give all of the boys and cheer for the Portland Timbers will be here. You ain't got to be 200 pounds or a giant at 7'3" to play this game called soccer, which is growing rapidly. You can hear it on the radio, you will see it on TV, but when the Portland boys appear, you will hear them sing with glee. Green is the colour, soccer is the game. We're the Portland Timbers, and winning is our aim. So let's be